Hello everyone, so this is Lala and today I am going to be doing my breakdown slash recap slash analysis of Era 2, which consists of seasons from the Gauntlet 2, Fresh Meat, the Duel, the Inferno 3, the Gauntlet 3, the Island, the Duel 2, the Ruins, Fresh Meat 2, and concluding with Cutthroat. I did a similar video for Era 1, which I will link above, and you can check it out if you care to do so. So pretty much I am going to talk about my general feelings about each of the seasons, but I am adding another category that I didn't do in the last era, where I'm breaking down the cast pertaining Era 1 representatives and Era 2 representatives, and you'll see the visual to see the change. Then I'll talk more about my feelings about the casts there. Then I'll talk about who are the faces of this era, who are supporting characters, and some other additional information. So let's just get right to it. Getting into Era 2 is very interesting since the format of the show, for the most part, has been established already, since the last era was all about building and setting a foundation to get to where we are. Not only just in Era 2, but in the present day that I'm recording this at the very end of Era 4. With this era, we had the cancellation of Road Rules, which was where half of the casting for the challenge came from up until this point, so there's a struggle with that entering this new era. It is also not a coincidence that even the final season in the prior era, i.e. the Inferno 2, stopped categorizing the teams as Road Rules versus Real World, and that remained all throughout this era, so that's the starting point. So the era started with the Gauntlet 2, which had a lot of the stars from the prior era appear and a few of the newer or more inexperienced people who debuted in late era 1. So like a season 8, a season 9, heck even some from a season 7, giving them the chance to make names for themselves. They continued the sequels in this era, where it started formatting or they started becoming commonplace in the late Era 1, with seasons like Battle of the Sexes 2 and the Inferno 2 being the two seasons right before this. And with the sequels, the teams were split differently, where in the first Gauntlet, it was split by the two shows, but here it was split by rookies versus veterans because Road Rules was cancelled. Rookies at this point in time in Chen's history are people who are on their first or second season, which will change in future eras when we eventually get there. While the veterans are people who did 3 or more seasons, and despite the expected imbalance, the teams were very even on a competitive point of view, which made it a more interesting watch. You did have the captain's format, which did cause for a very lopsided edit, and it's one of the weaker formats in my opinion, since no matter what, the captains always went in, and it just meant a bunch of people were safe throughout large portions of the season, and due to this imbalance, you had a lot of people not getting screen time at all. Though you could say that it made people like Derek into legends. Overall, it was a pretty entertaining season in spite of that, though a lot of the drama came more so from the competition instead of personality clashes, and we do have a few meltdowns throughout the season. But it was clear that a lot of the longtime veterans were either retiring or weren't bringing anything to the show anymore, so adding on to the already stagnant casting with the cancellation of Road Rules, and a lot of the veterans wanting to use the show as an advertisement for them to get bigger college or bar tools while sanitizing themselves, we were in for a major change and a much needed change. It could easily be assumed and claimed that this season was the last season in the OG era, especially since season 1 wasn't canon yet, but with TJ's introduction as the permanent host here and the eras being defined on Battle of the Eras, Era 2 definitely starts here. It's official. Also, the final was easily just the worst thing ever. It was based on a roti eating contest where only a few people partook in, meaning that several people who made it to the final didn't actually do anything. It was all just really lame. But honestly, the season was kind of just a mess, format-wise and even casting-wise, and it was better than it should have been, but I don't think it's going to be a higher tier season. It's probably just going to be mid-tier once I get to the end of this rewatch. So we move on to the next season where they went from a 32-player cast that the Gauntlet 2 was to a 24 cast with fresh meat, which has 12 of them that are either not even just challenge veterans, but also people who have been on an MTV show before, so this also includes rookies, I'll get to that later, and 12 of them who have never been on a reality show beforehand, but were rejects regarding the road rules or real world auditions, where the producers and the networks liked them enough, but not enough to put them on those shows, but liked them enough to put them here. So I am going to talk more about the casting changes throughout the era later on in the video, hence me not delving too deep into them here. But it did show that they needed some new blood, and it was a very smart choice, and it was a very intricate way that they ended up implementing them, since most of the rookies from this cast made their mark throughout the era and eventually took over the generation or era 1 veterans. Anyways, while this season was not the first one done in the partners format, where I believe Battle of the Seasons technically did it, it was the first one not done in teams, and the pairs were playing for themselves, since as they were partners in Battle of the Seasons, they were all-star a part of either the Road Rules team or the Real World team, so it's different compared to Fresh Meat. Anyways, the format of the season was pretty simple, with the winners choosing one pair to go to Exile and the house votes for the other pair, where the Exiles are the eliminations. I did like the season, though I didn't really love it either, as it didn't have many of the highs that I like in a challenge season. There really wasn't a whole lot of drama, from what I remember, and while the cast were likable enough, there were definitely some duds as well. Anyways, this was a foundational season regarding doing less large team seasons and introducing a nice set of challengers, so that's really all I have to say about the season. And just looking at the people who are here, you start to see that many of them definitely made their mark, and there are a few who are starting to get withered out, where it's more noticeable on the Gauntlet too, because so many of them just never came back, took long hiatuses after there, but the process is slower with Fresh Meat. But in general, this is like a decent season, nothing more, nothing less. With some of the veterans hanging around, mainly from people who debuted in late Era 1, becoming stars, some of the new fresh meat coming in as well, and some of the veterans who are on their way out, in addition to the key West rookies coming in, made for a thrilling season with the Duel, where pretty much everyone contributed to the season heavily one way or another. There was a lot of personal and gameplay drama, which is something that tends to be missing on a lot of challenge seasons. Despite the competitive side being a bit of a steamroll, mainly on the women's end, it was definitely more competitive with the men side. What made this season stand out especially was the fact that it's the first individual season, meaning that everyone has to fight for themselves and aren't tied down to a partner or a team, as the best man and the best woman individually won for their gender. And this also means that only 2 men and 2 women made it to the final. So you really had to earn your spot, you really had to compete and politic to get to your spot. And I think because of the smaller cast and the smaller amount of spaces, it calls for a much more balanced edit, which was definitely an issue with some of the past seasons, and hell, even all of the future seasons as well. So there was a lot more freedom with this format change when it comes to the gameplay and how people adapt it. And while that in itself is rare, regarding the individual format, it would become a lot more commonplace to have individual seasons in late Era 3 and especially in Era 4. So it was definitely ahead of its time with the format. And I think that's why out of a lot of the seasons from especially Era 1 and even Era 2, this one has definitely aged the best compared to a lot of them. In general, it is one of my favorite seasons thus far, and it's probably my favorite from this era, and I don't have a whole lot to say about it that I haven't already said in my review for it. The next season would be the first in the fact that this is the first trilogy series, and trilogies would be more commonplace in this era with the Inferno 3. With how much I loved the first 2 Infernos, I was extremely disappointed with this season, as it just pales in comparison all the way around. From a casting point of view, from a drama point of view, I didn't really care too much about the competitive point of view. and it's really just disappointing. And it's funny looking at who is on the good guys team and who's on the badasses team, but that's really just due to hindsight. So, like I briefly just mentioned, we went back to two teams which were split by good guys and badasses, like its direct predecessor, i.e., the Inferno 2, used as their template. And the format didn't change at all, if I remember correctly, and some of the slight ickiness and misogyny that this era would eventually become known for, in addition to the violence that took place in this era, would kind of start around here. Oh yeah, this also had the lifesaver as well, but I guess that made things a bit more interesting due to Susie always saving herself and Kara trying to help Susie save herself. But yeah, I think this might be the last season with the lifesaver, or it's one of the last seasons that has it. So anyways, there were more people from Key West, Austin, and especially Denver making their debuts here. Some are veterans retiring / taking long hiatuses, and the era 2 newbies started really taking over slightly in this season pertaining the era. The season in itself really isn't horrible, and it is watchable enough, but it is very forgettable, and you don't take much from it after you are finished watching it, even if it was slightly competitive between the teams, and only two people really had a decent amount of seasons, mainly Jen and Tyree, though the latter is kind of just a joke. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about it. So we reach the midpoint of the era with the Gauntlet 3, continuing the theme of trilogies right after last season, but with the Gauntlet here. And there are many similarities to the second Gauntlet, which we started the era with. The teams were split up by the veterans, or alumni, which are people who have done 3 or more seasons, and the rookies, which are people who have done or who are on their first or second season. And unlike that season, the competitive element in this season was not balanced whatsoever, and it was lopsided as hell, with the veterans stopping over the rookies, who are a much weaker team than the rookie team on the Gauntlets 2. And if it wasn't for the military-sponsored rule, the veterans would have won the season, though them losing definitely made the season much more interesting. Of course, there was the quote-unquote cut the fat strategy, which the alumni men essentially used to get rid of most of the women on their team, even if they were struggling, even if they held their own, but they believed that men were better than women were useless, and they are proud to echo that chamber, and they repeated this for seasons after this. So the misogyny and stuff really started to kind of just follow along after this season, up until pretty damn close to the end of the era. Personally, I did like the drama that was on both teams during the season, as they kept it up from the very beginning to the very end. But, like I mentioned, the misogyny was something that I did not like, but I will say that the women stood their ground this season and didn't let the men walk all over them, which really wasn't the case with some of the latter seasons, but we do get a few more Era 1 retirements with the season as well. A lot of people do not view the season as highly as I do, due to the stupid rule of the final, how the competition element was so not interesting or competitive at all, and even when the alumni did throw certain challenges, it really wasn't that interesting. So I guess I have the unpopular opinion of seeing this season relatively highly, though it's probably only like in the upper middle tier once I get down to everything. But it was really the last season where it wasn't a complete JEK plus D fest. So yeah. And things would definitely change after this. Just looking at the list, the rookies, the real rookies, really didn't do much. The only one who did more than a few seasons is Tori, who only did 3 seasons. The ones who did get 2 seasons really weren't memorable or notable. So this rookie class in general, not very memorable. We move on to the island, and it is a horror show, and I'm not going to mince words about it. The format of having no dailies, but immunity challenges between the 3 nominees, essentially, and then a vote out was horrendous, and the conditions were somehow even worse than Survivor, which was made even worse because they were given a bunch of alcohol and little to no food, making the cast act even worse than they normally would have already acted. I guess I could give them props for trying something very, very, very new. I don't know if they wanted to replicate Survivor, since Survivor was no longer in its peak, despite it still being very culturally relevant at this point in time. Or they wanted to do something very cheap, since I believe this was being filmed at around the time of the strike. I have no idea, but it was a failure, and they've never done anything like it again, and rightfully so. Johnny and Kenny ran the show from start to finish, and their ratchet misogyny was very emphasized and rewarded throughout the season, not even just by the cast, but by production and the network as well. This really was the start of the era to crew taking over, and I will say that we did get some important storylines / interactions that carried over to the next 4 to 5 seasons. So while it is a horror season, it is an important season, so it really can't be ignored. When you look at the rookie class from 15 to 18, and a lot of them being flops, I think the 16 cast fared a bit more. We saw Kellyanne and Kohara do a few more seasons outside of the era, and they've even done more modern seasons. Dunbar had a decent enough run as well, so I guess they're a mediocre-ish rookie class just based off of the amount of seasons that they did. So we are moving on to the Duel 2, which is the sequel of the Duel, and it is the first Duel-themed trilogy or series that was introduced in this era. So of course it meant that the same format was going to be used here that was used on the first one. It's an individual game where one person of each gender wins the entire season, and there's a schoolyard pick to determine who gets nominated, and the nominees gets to call out anyone but the daily winners. And this is a great format that proves that you gotta get the smoke if you want the smoke, and it gives the underdogs a chance to call out the people who wronged them. It seemed like they went out of their way to cast like toxic people this season, which was refreshing, but it could be a double-edged sword, since from a competitive point of view, it was a complete bore fest, and there wasn't a whole lot of drama in the season either. But I do see it as a tonal refresh, and I think the location as well as the format brought out some interest in a lot of the interactions within the cast that caused for a lot of the flaws to be overlooked, in my opinion. But I don't have the season nearly as high as some others do, just based on the research that I've done. In general, I see it as a watchable, but not really a good season, but it's pretty middle of the road. In general, there really isn't much to say about this season. And even when you look at the rookie class, they really didn't accomplish much. They did return, but many of them pretty much didn't do much of anything. I see, the only one that did more than 2 seasons is Siobhan, and she was out early on all of her seasons. The person who made it to the finals never returned, and I guess out of this crop, Kimberly's probably the most memorable one, since she had 2 solid runs on her seasons, but in general, the rookie class, very forgettable. Now that we are in late era 2, we are now at the other season that is arguably peak toxicity in the show's history with the Ruins, where this was the starting point of the cast not really being allowed to really travel around in the location that they were in, from what I've read, and they were barely let outside, even in like the backyard. So that is one of the contributing elements to the toxicity of the season, in addition to all of the men displaying misogynistic behavior. Even the ones that usually didn't show it in the past or in the future did it here, and the ones who have been displaying it for a few seasons now continue to do it here. Apparently, it was here where production got very, very, very strict with what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, especially regarding the travel, and that's why a lot of the people from the older eras complain about the newer seasons, but people who came on in the more recent seasons, especially if they came from other shows like Big Brother, they see it as nothing. But that's kind of just me rambling. Back on the topic, there's a lot of violence in the season, and some alleged non-consensual sexual antics that caused for a lawsuit to be filed and changed the trajectory of the show. The pranks really weren't fun, and while there was some emphasis on some good drama that didn't involve the ickiness, it was clear that the season and the show at this point was a bubble that's about to burst. But I also feel like this was around the time where the producers were kind of hoping stuff like this would happen, since they're competing with a lot of the VH1 shows, some of the other MTV shows, and even some of the CBS shows were getting a lot more dramatic in comparison. So the format was that the winners were able to choose which of the nominated people from their teams were to go into elimination, where before the challenge, 3 people per gender on each team had to nominate one another or nominate themselves. When it comes to the competition, the challengers were completely dominated and steamrolled by the champions, and it's arguably the most lopsided season ever, and you do feel drained after watching it. But when it comes to the format itself, I actually do like it. The issue wasn't the format, the issue was the imbalanced teams. But yeah, this definitely isn't one of my favorite seasons in the era, but I don't think it's in the bottom 2 either, since it does have some positives that even some of the more icky and boring seasons that don't have. And I think it's more watchable than some of the seasons that are either kind of boring, like the Inferno 3, and seasons that it's just trash all around, like The Island. Fresh Meat 2 is the second sequel for a theme that was introduced in this era, and to me, it's clear that they decided to do it now, since the first Fresh Meat crop and the early Era 2 rookies are now vets. Damn near all the Era 1 people are gone now, and a lot of the more recent rookies from the last few seasons, especially the ones that debuted in the second half of the era, really didn't have any longevity and really weren't that memorable, outside of a very few people and a very few. Anyways, so the season had the same format as the first Fresh Meat, with the winners choosing a nominee, the house choosing to nominate the other person to go to Excel, and this is a fine format. Like the first Fresh Meat, I do like this one, but I don't think it's going to be one of my top seasons once I finish the series rewatch. I do think that the storylines in this season was a lot more consistent and linear, especially with it being Team West versus Team Kenny, which has been built up over the last few seasons, so I guess it's a bit meaty compared to the first Fresh Meat in this regard. So, I do think that the Fresh Meat cast, when it comes to the newbies, is a bit flawed, since a decent amount of them are going to be duds on average, and I feel this way about Fresh Meats in general, and a few of them will be successful, and I definitely feel that way about this crop of Fresh Meat. Obviously, we have people like Carmaria, Laura, and to a lesser extent, Teresa, Mandy, and Brandon, who have a decent run, but there are a decent amount of them who only appeared this season, and some of them were given another season, but they didn't really make much of themselves. So overall, season 19 is a solid to good season. I doubt it's going to be in my top tier. And the final season of the era is Cutthroat, where they decided to do 3 teams for the entire time, and it really did make things interesting, since there was some competitiveness between the teams, and it wasn't an outright steamroll. One team wins the daily, and then they have no involvement in whatever else happens, as the other 2 teams have to vote in a man and a woman to face off against one another, where one from each gender ends up going home. It's very simple and effective. I do really like the season, but I would be lying if I said that it reached the height of some of the best challenge seasons, but it is consistently good. A lot of the people who defined the season were on their way. Sorry. A lot of the people who defined this era were on their way out, so we needed some of the recent rookies to make a name for themselves, and I do think the season did a good enough job at that. The ratings being low for 2010 standards of the last 2 seasons caused for them to focus more on the big names and emphasizing a lot of the relationships into the theme of what would be the era 3 seasons. And I also noticed that this would be the last team season for the most part, with the exception of a few large team seasons that were very sparsely sprinkled into Era 3 and Era 4, but it wasn't a consistent thing like it is, or like it was in Era 1 and Era 2. So, my commentary about the rookie class of this season. We definitely had some flops on the cast, with some of them doing 2 seasons but doing absolutely nothing of note or doing poorly on both of them. We had a 1-season wonder, but we had staples like Camilla, who essentially did every season from Cutthroat up until Dirty 30, give or take 1 or 2 seasons. Derek, I guess, is now someone who's had longevity with being on Battle of the Eras and some of the All-Star seasons. Emily and Ty also had a decent enough run as well. So yeah, I guess the rookie class just on paper isn't a flop overall, or it's close enough to being a mixed bag. I mentioned in the beginning of this video that I decided to do something where I looked at each of the 10 casts and which ones were Era 1 and which ones were Era 2, meaning which cast members debuted in Era 1 and Era 2 in each season, and I'm using the colors that is used on Battle of the Eras to see how the transition of the era pertaining to the cast took place. So I'm going to start that now. Looking at the Gauntlet 2 cast, there are really only 4 rookies in the sense of this being their very first season, since most of the quote-unquote rookie team on this season were people who were on their second season, and they were mainly from Battle of the Sexes 2, the Gauntlet, and the Inferno, with a few of the second-timers also coming from other seasons sporadically. They apparently struggled with getting a lot of the big-time veterans on this cast and season due to pay disputes, some wanting to do other opportunities, and others focusing more on their college and bar tours. So this season was a struggle when it comes to the casting department, and it probably explained the theme of rookies versus veterans, and most of the rookies being sophomores, essentially. The only big names on the veteran side that I really see is Ruthie, Cyrus is debatable if you want to consider him a big name, Beth, Brad. I don't know if Brad was a big name at this time yet. Kind of the same thing with Anissa. Okay, I get it now. Brad, Anissa, and Derek were not big names yet. Timmy was a big name, so was Mark, and Katie was as well. Even Julie is debatable pertaining whether you want to consider her a big name or not for this era. A lot of these people on both sides that I didn't list could have used the season to make big names for themselves on the show, but the format of the Captain's Twist prevented that from happening, and causing for the captains to get most of the screen time, and whomever isn't automatically chosen to go into elimination in the deliberations were safe for most of the season, didn't have to do much, and they were ignored by the edit. So a lot of them couldn't really make anything of themselves during the season. So it's clear that at this point in time that this crop of challengers really couldn't carry the show. Hence, most of the newbies not proving themselves, a lot of the veterans getting big-headed, and this being the final season for David, Julie, Mark's first retirement, which has made him someone who randomly appears instead of retiring, since this would not be his first or only time retiring. The final season for Montana. We also had Cyrus and Ruthie doing one more flagship season years after this, so they weren't regulars anymore. The final season for Gisela and Adam, though both would return for All-Stars, not the flagship, almost 20 years later. Timmy had one more season left, so he was on his way out. Ibis returned years later to do her final season, so she wasn't consistent. Jamie retired, Jody and Keena had one more season left, and Jody returned over a decade later. Landon took a long break, Randy was done after this, Susie did one more season years after this before leaving, Jeremy was done, Kara had one more season left, Alton had one more season before a long hiatus, and then we had people like Danny, Cameron, and Joe never coming back. That's a lot of the cast that was essentially on their way out. Obviously, with this being the first season of the new era, there wasn't going to be many quote-unquote Era 2 people on it, and this is also around the time where Road Rules got cancelled, so they were struggling in the casting department due to half of their casting pool essentially going kaput, so that added to the struggle. Out of the newbies, Jillian is the only one, as well as MJ, who did more than one season, and I don't think either one of them were very memorable in the grand scheme of things. Though MJ kind of got a boost due to All-Stars, so I guess it gives him the bump over Jillian. With everything I mentioned with the prior season and Road Rules getting cancelled, where half of the casting for the show came from, there's clearly a need to get some new blood urgently, hence having the cast of fresh meat, and that being the theme of the entire season. Half of the cast were people who were never on reality TV before, but they were people who auditioned for either Road Rules or The Real World, but didn't make it onto either show. So half of the cast were filled with these people, and most of them ended up becoming huge or notable figures to the challenge, lexicon, and franchise, especially in this era. This includes people like Evelyn, one of the strongest women ever, Ryan, Eric, Evan, DM, before her passing, obviously, Casey, Kenny, and even Aviv is currently making a comeback. Even a decent amount of the quote-unquote alumni, which were the non-fresh meat people, which made up the other half of the cast, had some rookies on it, where people from the real world Austin, like Wes, Johanna, Melinda, and Danny, debuted, and they also did several seasons, though most of them were relegated to this era, with only Wes having main longevity and Melinda doing a few All-Star seasons. With this in mind, over half of the cast were rookies, and even if you look at the veterans, only Derek and Katie were on last season, so it kind of just shows how they felt about the cast of last season. We do have Shane and Theo, where the latter leaves the show for good after this, and Shane comes back over a decade later, but they are both gone from the show after this, essentially. And Theo acts like the challenge was the worst thing that ever happened, to the point where he is shading it, or he shaded it since. With Tina and Coral also being veterans who only had one more season in them after this, but at this point, no one thought that they were leaving, and they were expected to do many more seasons. Darrell does take a few years off after this, since this is his fourth season and his fourth, when Derek becomes a big-time vet around this point, which I didn't really mention regarding last season, with Tanya and Katie still being consistent veterans here. We do have a few more one-season wonders like Jesse, Johnny, Lynette, and Chanda, with none of them really being memorable, but I feel like this cast regarding the Fresh Meat has less one-season wonders compared to the second Fresh Meat crew. So we move on to the Duel, where the balance between Eras 1 and Eras 2 pertaining the debutees are more balanced. There are 9 people from Era 1 here, though you had Jodie who was on her way out, Tina as well who's on her way out due to punching Beth idiotically, and Kina who are all on their last seasons, though Jodie would do some spin-offs like 13 to 14 years later, and was circumstantially on 40, and Kina even changed her name so she could distance herself from her MTV time, with all the others being regulars at this point in time, like Robin, Derek, Anissa, CT, Brad, and even Beth, though she also is slowly on her way out, as she has one more flagship season after this. Regarding the Era 2 people, there are 11 people from this era in a 20-player cast, so there's 2 more Era 2 people than Era 1, so things are pretty much split down the middle. We have first-timers like John, who will be known or arguably be seen as the face of the challenge, as he has done the most seasons, Paula, who is one of the main girls of this era, Tyler, who has an interesting enough run, and Nehemiah, who all got several seasons to make names for themselves and will be important especially for this season. And some of them have even made it past this era. And Svetlana is one of the most memorable one-season wonders ever, and 4 of them being from Key West and Nehemiah being from Austin. So they're really starting to put more Austin and Key West people on the show at around this time. And then we have second-timers from Fresh Meat coming back, like Casey and Kenny, though both of them are less memorable this season. Eric, who is just there with his usual shtick. Evan, DM, and Wes also having very strong seasons here. I feel like the season had the great balance between the 2 eras, with establishing the veterans who are here to stay, a few who are on their way out, and some of the Era 2 people becoming veterans, and some notable rookies, and this nice balance is something that I don't feel like the rest of the era has in general. This cast had a mix of people who were mainly competitors, other people who were mainly strategists or politicians, others who were mainly there for drama, and some who fell generally 2 of the 3. So it's generally a perfect balance, and it's a small cast, and the smaller the casts, it's usually the better. We move on to the Inferno 3, where 10 Era 1 people come back, with CT coming back after a successful duel, though he barely lasted here. Anissa coming back right away, Tanya and Derek being regulars, Abram coming back from his first. Oh, sorry. Abrams coming back for his first season in this era, and we actually do see a lot of people who are on the Gauntlet 2 coming back here, like Ace, Alton, Kara, Susie, and Timmy, who does end up retiring after the season, so they don't forget about this season's cast. Though even just looking at it, Ace and Kara are also done after the season. Alton takes a long hiatus after this. Susie is off for a few years after this as well. So we do get a lot of rookies from the real world Denver on here making their mark through Tyree, Coley, Jen, and Davis. Though I would say only Jen's a really good casting choice that lasted a while and made a decent mark, but that's kind of just besides the point. We have some rookies from Key West, i.e. Janelle, who is always kind of just there, though she did a few seasons here and there, including the flagship and the spinoffs, and someone from Austin, i.e. Rachel, who's just forgettable in general. Though a lot of these rookies honestly aren't memorable and don't have much longevity, with the exception of a few of them. Like Jen, and I guess Tyree, though he flopped on all of them. And I don't know if Janelle's someone who you would say has longevity, since she had, almost 20 years of a gap. And when she came back, it was on All Stars. Anyways, returning players from Era 2 are Danny, Paula, John, Kenny, and Evelyn, as their stock starts to increase more and more pertaining to position on the show, but they're not the top dogs yet. Overall, there are 11 people from Era 2 on this season, so the split between the eras are about half and half yet again. Despite all that, this cast really just doesn't gel for whatever reason, and it just doesn't pop. It is really from the Gauntlet 3 onwards where the cast members are consistently represented overwhelmingly by Era 2 people. Obviously, the quote-unquote rookie team, which are 1 to 2 season players, are going to be represented mainly by Era 2 people, where we have people from Denver, Road Rules vs. Revenge with the brief revival of that show, and Key West here, though the only memorable true rookie is Tori. I don't really care to mention anyone else because they're just not really relevant. A few second timers come in, like Tyler, who would take a few seasons off after this, Janelle, who leaves the flagship after this but returns for All Stars, Tyree, who we see much more of for some odd reason, MJ, who was an alternate who joined once Tyree left, Ryan, who's kind of just there, and he'll be kind of just there for a few more seasons, and the same with Rachel, honestly, and some who are a bit more memorable, like Melinda, Nehemiah, Johanna, and Jillian, all to a lesser or better extent, depending on how you see it. Frank is the only Era 1 quote-unquote rookie, and the fact that he came back to join the season after his initial season was so many years ago and taking so many seasons off is so weird, but it is so welcoming based on what he offered to the season. Regarding the veterans, there are 7 Era 1 people, with Beth and Coral on their way out after this season, and the Era 2 vets making it very known that they aren't welcome anymore, though Beth would do All Stars way after this. Katie and Robin, who are just there this season, and honestly it's kind of the same with Brad and Adam being just there as well. CT continues his unluckability this season, just without the violence compared to his prior season and his succeeding season. And then we have what would become the JEK crew and their minions taking over the season with Kenny, Evan, and John, who was booted early here, DM, Eric, Evan, Evelyn, Kenny, Paula, Danny, and even Casey, making it clear that this is their show now, and they make up 9 of the veteran spots, and the next several seasons will essentially revolve around them. So overall, there are 25 Era 2 people and 8 Era 1 people on the season. So you see the huge lopsidedness, but it does make sense based off of everything that I described over the past 4 seasons and this season, and things will only get more lopsided from here on out. If the prior season didn't make it clear, the island made it abundantly clear that the challenge is the Era 2 crop show pertaining to the cast. There are only 5 people from Era 1 on the season, with Rachel, Tanya, Abram, by his choice, going home very early in the season, leaving us with Derek, who was essentially a part of the Johnny Kenny crew, and Robin, who found herself on the outs with people in power, which would end up changing the trajectory of her time on the show. We got a decent amount of rookies from Sydney, i.e. Dunbar, Kellyanne, Ashley, Kahara, Dave from Hollywood, and Dan from Road Rules Fierce Revenge, with that show being cancelled for good after that season. Returning Era 2 people are Coley, who is done after yet another unmemorable season, Tyree, Johanna, who engages in a very controversial hookup with Kenny, Ryan, which is probably his most successful performance thus far, as I'm recording this, Jen, Paula, who starts her arc of getting consistently turned on by the guys last minute, Evelyn, who has a strong Underdark arc this season and for a lot of the rest of her time on the show, Johnny, who really became his own on the season for good or for bad, and Kenny being the main stars of the season. It is essentially the lot here, with the exception of a few people who will take over the remaining seasons of the era from a storytelling, character, competitive, and strategic point of view, leaving there to be 15 people from this era, making up 75% of the cast. I will say that the rookie crop from this cast is a bit more successful than some of the ones immediately before this and even immediately after, with Dunbar doing several seasons and becoming an eventual camp. Kellyanne and Kohara also did a good amount of seasons as well, up until the more modern day. And I believe Dan got another season as well, though his time was cut short essentially. So out of the late teens, this cast printing the newbies is probably one of the most successful. It seems like the Duel 2 went out of their way to bring back a decent amount of Era 1 people, some who have been consistent over the last few seasons, so people like CT and Adam who were booted immediately, Robin, Katie, Anissa, and Brad, and somewhat Rachel, though I say somewhat because she was on the last season, but that was her first season in this era, and others who hadn't been on for a while, i.e. Mark, Landon, and Ruthie. This adds up to 10 people, but most of them aren't sticking around for the long haul anyways. So their appearance on this season were pretty much like cameos, if that kind of makes sense. The rookies from this season are Nick, Siobhan, Isaac, Kimberly, and Brittany, who were either from the Real World Sydney or the Real World Hollywood, and most of them were pretty unmemorable to be honest. Where Brittany is the only one who didn't come back, but all the others who did come back didn't really bring a whole lot to the table. And I guess the most memorable ones are Siobhan, despite her floppage, and Kimberly, who had 2 decent runs. Anyways, the Era 2 veterans here are Evan, DM, MJ, who yet again was an alternate bumped up, and this would be his final flagship season, though of course he returned for All-Stars. Tori, Derek in his final season after an unmemorable performance here. Jen, Dunbar, Paula, Nehemiah, who was also promoted as an alternate. Brooke, who shared the same fate as Derek, and Ryan here. The issue with this cast is that there was a lack of bigger personalities, so after the whole CT and Adam situation played out, it was a very low-stakes season, especially on the men's side when it comes to the personality standpoint. There are 18 people from Era 2 on here, so despite the increase of Era 1 veterans, they still make up for 1/3 of the cast, where Era 2 makes up roughly 2/3 of the cast. We move on to the Ruins, and a lot of the bigger names made it onto the season. Wes came out of retirement to do the season after the whole Kenny and Johanna situation played out over the last year, and he was dating Kellyanne, and that relationship brought some drama. Evelyn and DM had short runs here, which it was odd for DM's case but memorable in Evelyn's case. JEK were reunited here and at their peak of their powers, which led to the more toxic elements of the season, leading up to the whole Tanya situation, and I might as well talk about that now. If they did do what was alleged, they deserved to get banned, they deserved to get punished, and the production was horrible for covering it up and enabling this bullshit, knowing that it was wrong just for cheap ratings. And if they didn't do it, it's unfortunate that MTV left them hanging, but at the same time, they should have known that MTV was going to look at for themselves, not for Evan and Kenny. And the fact that they were doing things that were teetering on the line for so many seasons and for quite a few years, something was bound to blow up, and this just so happened to have been it. But I do think that their dismissal from the show is for the betterment of the show, though the aftermath of this wouldn't take place until early Era 3, and that's all I'm going to say about it here. So, Dunbar appears here, and Kahara has a decent enough sophomore season, though he takes a hiatus after the season, just like Kellyanne does, and then they both, of course, return mid-Era 3 at around the same time. Johanna also leaves after the season here, as it was just too much, with Kimberly and Nick also having their runs on the show permanently done here. The rookies include Chet, one season wonder, and the rookie of the season in Sarah, who is easily the standout, but 2 out of the 3 rookies have decent enough runs, an amazing run in Sarah's case, on the show, so I guess the rookies weren't really duds. Overall, Era 2 makes up 18 players on the cast, and we do have a lot of returning Era 1 people who came back after a hiatus in Duel and Veronica, with Veronica going right back into not only a hiatus after this, but a longer hiatus than her first one, reappearing at the very end of Era 3. Susie, Cyrus, and Ibis returning, only to be done with the show right after this, though Cyrus does All-Stars, leaving us with the regulars in Derek, Brad, Adam, winding down Katie, and Tanya, who leaves on a sad note after this season due to her lawsuit, and this adds up to 10 players from Era 1 appearing here, which causes for a similar ratio to the last season when it comes to the 2 eras and the representation. So we go back to the hugely lopsided casts with this season, or the era, where the only Era 1 people on Fresh Meat 2 are Landon, who retires for good after this, and Darrell, who takes a very long hiatus after this season. We do get a group of Fresh Meat, where at least half of them are duds on the season, but the only ones who have longevity are Carmaria, Laurel, Teresa, and Brandon, though Vinny and Mandy returned a few times, and Luke got another season. One season wonders include Jeff, Sandy, Sydney, Nora, Pete, and Carly. So if I remember correctly, that's 2 more one-season wonders compared to Fresh Meat 1's one-season wonders. So clearly they weren't that successful here. And if you even compare the ones who lasted a while or who got more seasons to the Fresh Meat 1 people who got more seasons, Fresh Meat 1 is definitely more successful in general, despite Carmaria doing damn near every season that she can. So, Caitlin and CJ also represent rookies who are part of the quote-unquote alumni side, and neither of them being memorable during their 2-season runs, where they are continue to cast people from the Real World Brooklyn, and they're starting to incorporate people from the Real World Cancun. Sarah, Paula, Danny, Wes, Evelyn, Jen, Kenny, and Ryan, who's on his last season until the circumstantial 40 and returning for All-Stars, are the regulars, with Jillian also having her last season as well. Despite making it to the end, she's just not really memorable. This means 24 out of the 26 cast members are from Era 2, costing for a 92% for this era and an 8% for the prior era. I really don't have anything else to say with this cast. So, on to the final cast of this era. The Cutthroat cast had 4 people from Era 1, and all of them are on their last legs. Abram only does 2 seasons after this, and they are very spread out after the season, with Brad, Katie, and Derek all retiring after the season, though Brad comes back after his divorce during Era 4, and Derek doing a flagship season every 10 years, and Katie only doing a flagship season for the circumstantial 40. While I do know that Katie and Brad had intended to retire here, I don't know if that was the case for Derek, since I know he mentioned that he wanted to get cast, but he didn't after this point. But when you look at the Era 3 seasons, he doesn't really fit any of the themes. He didn't really have any hookups like that, and he didn't really have any feuds. So I guess it makes sense why he wasn't on Era 3 until Dirty 30. All of these people would regularly appear on All Stars though, and they make up 13% of this cast. The rookies include Derek, Emily, JD, and Aya, who are all unmemorable, though Derek has gotten a few more chances and even a second win with All Stars and 40. Ty and Emily are a bit more memorable as they gained a few seasons and made more of an impact. And Camila is definitely the biggest standout, for good and for bad. And honestly, it's mainly for bad, as she did essentially every season that she could until she was pretty much banned from the show after 30-30, or technically Champs vs. Stars. Tori, Luke, Dan, and Siobhan are on their last season, with people like Tyler, Melinda, Vinny, Jen, and Eric clearly winding down pertaining their time on the show. This leads to the more consistent veterans being Dunbar, Paula, Brandon, Chet, Mandy, Carmuya, Laurel, Sarah, Bananas, and Teresa. Some of those are definitely becoming up-and-comers, with Era 2 making up 87% of the cast. A season and a cast like this definitely needed to happen, where they gave a lot of the more recent rookies or the new veterans a chance to make names for themselves to see if they can really hang, and so they won't be overshadowed by some of the big names. And I know that's why a lot of people don't really care as much for the season, but something like this needs to happen every once in a while, since you can't just really get on the same old names over and over and over and over again. So, like in the last video where I discussed Era 1, I am going to surmise who I feel like are the faces of this era. But Era 1, where 4 of those seasons were very isolatory, all of the seasons on Era 2 are very intertwined with one another. So I decided to use a different format. The format that I decided to use was to list down and write down the top 6 confessional givers in each Era 2 season, and then based on the amounts that a person appeared on the list. So for an example, person 1 showed up on the top 6 confessional givers of an era 5 times. Person A will, on this list, be listed as 5 times, meaning they partook in 5 seasons and they were a top 5 confessional giver in all 5 seasons. That's just an example that I am surmising. It'll make sense once you look at the list. And on the other side, you will have the amount of times that a player did seasons in this era. And this includes people who did 4 or more seasons. I don't feel like you can be a face of an era if you've only been on 3 seasons, especially in this era where, compared to the last era, I was more lenient on people who did 3 seasons could be the faces of that era due to how isolatory the first 4 seasons are. That's not the case here. So in my opinion, you need to do at least 4 seasons in order to be seen as a face of the era. So I combined both lists, or looked at both lists to see which people made it on both lists, and that will somewhat determine, or on paper, it will determine who are the faces of the era. So these are the people that come up on the list. The top row are the people who debuted in Era 1, but they were on Era 2, and they had a lot of moments that they're most known for on Era 2. They all did a decent amount of seasons, and they're in the top 6 most confessionals in quite a few seasons. Derek really isn't shocking, because they're definitely trying to position him as the main guy of the show, especially in the beginning of the era. And while he did do 7 seasons, and he was on 3 of the top 6 confessional givers on a season, he really started to peter off during the second half of the era, as he became the side guy and the under-edited guy to Johnny, Evan, and Kenny. So in a way, he is one of the faces, but he became a side character by the end of the era. Brad really isn't shocking, because he had his romance turned marriage with Tori in this era. He also had a lot of close wins, or close second places. He had a lot of interesting moments here, and he's been very consistent. So him being one of the few Era 1 guys to really be strong in Era 2 really isn't surprising. And both he and JEK debuted in the tail end of Era 1. Hence them not being on that list when it comes to notable people, and them being on the notable people pertaining this era of seasons. Anissa is kind of like them, though she debuted earlier in Era 1, but she just wasn't memorable in either of those seasons. And she did 4 seasons compared to like their 6 and 7, so she did less seasons. When you look at all 4 of the seasons, she made it to the finals on 2 of them and was booted right before the finals on the other 2. She definitely had her fair share of moments, fights, elimination wins, and all of that. And the fact that she's the only non-white person on this list really just shows how people of color are edited on the show, especially at around this time. But even with Anissa, I'm debating moving her to the supporting character people. But when it comes to the woman of this era, she is one of the few notable ones. So the Era 2 people really aren't shocking. Evan and Kenny, it was essentially their show from the very beginning of their time on the show. Throughout the end of the era, they did so many seasons, they made it to the end almost every single time, and they really had the political chokehold, and they really got the chokehold of the editors and the screen time on the season, so this isn't shocking. Paula was the main woman on the season, as I believe she did the most seasons, and she, out of all the women, had 3 seasons where she's the top 6 confessional giver, so she really kicked it up a notch, though I feel like she became more into her own during the second half of the era, though she was more consistent than the likes of Evelyn, who really only became kind of like a main character during the second half of the era, and even then she had that early boot in the Ruin, so she wasn't as consistent as Paula, but she's definitely a very notable woman on the era, hence her being here. DM always got a decent amount of screen time in all of her seasons. She had her cancer story, she had her showmance with CT, even though he got expelled and she didn't, and she almost always made it far, except for Ruins, where it seemed clear to me that she wanted to go home. Wes and Johnny really weren't surprising, though Johnny definitely came off as like the third man on the totem pole, but he definitely had his moments later on in Era 2 where he really started to become his own. Ryan was definitely a shocker. I know he did 5 seasons, and I believe he was a top 6 confessional giver on Fresh Meat 2, and I think the Gauntlet 3. I think that was the other season. But when you think of Era 2, you don't really have many Ryan moments, so I might move him down to the supporting, but I guess he's just more consistent than the others, who either did less seasons or was only a strong confessional giver or top 6 confessional giver on like a season. So yeah. Wes really isn't shocking at all. From the very beginning of the season, he just dominated the screen time and the confessionals, even during the seasons where he only made it halfway through, like the Ruins, and he made it far in every other season. Honestly, I would probably divide this list by category, so I think the people in the subcategory or a tier 2 category of this list would probably be someone like an Anissa, Orion, arguably a JEK as well, just based off of his poor trajectory in the second half of the era. But some of them I might move to the supporting. So now I'm going to talk about the supporting cast members of this era. So these are people who weren't the faces of the era, but they were significant enough, relevant enough, and did enough seasons to make a mark on the season, but it just wasn't major. I already talked about Anissa and Ryan, so I'm not going to delve more into them. Katie did 6 seasons, and I think she only did well on 2 of them, and those were the Gauntlet seasons, and she had very poor edits on those seasons as well, so despite the amount of seasons she did, she was never really that important. Robin, kind of the same thing, she got a poor edit on the Gauntlet too, outside of that whole Mark situation. The Duel, she had that awful moment with Anissa, and then, yeah, she didn't get much screen time on Gauntlet 3, and then her other 2 seasons, there really just wasn't a whole lot there for her. She was always supporting at best, so I guess this fits. Danny is someone who did 5 seasons, and I think the only season he did decently on is the Inferno 3 and the Gauntlet 3. And he never really had a huge edit either. And I guess he made it midway through Fresh Meat 2, so it's not the worst, so I guess it's not the best either. Eric is someone who's never really relevant. He kind of just had his shtick of being the jokester, beggar guy, but he was never a main character, and he really did very well anyways. CT is someone who is interesting because he has a lot of importance on the seasons that he did well on, especially the duel with his relationship with DM, and obviously he made it far on the Gauntlet 3. He made it to the final on that season, but he didn't have the biggest edit, but he didn't have the smallest edit either, but I don't know if he was really one of the main characters. And of course we have his two other seasons with Inferno 3 and the Duel 2, where he got kicked out on the first episode because he kept on getting violent. While those are very memorable, they're not really main character moments because he was barely on those seasons. I'm assuming he'll be bumped up in Era 3. And I'm shocked that he really wasn't that present. Adam is someone who did 4 seasons. He was always kind of just there, and I feel like his relevance increased due to CT, but when you look at the other seasons that he was on, the Gauntlet 3, he made it to the end but barely got screen time outside of CT. The Duel 2, he got beat up by CT, and he was irrelevant on the other 2 seasons he was on this era. Casey got a huge edit on Fresh Meat, but that's because she had to get a huge edit on those seasons. She made it far on the Gauntlet 3, but didn't have much screen time. And she did make it very far on the ruins, as she almost made it to the final, but she got the clown edit. Johanna is someone who's kind of just there. She's an early boot on her first season. She was in the main alliance on the Gauntlet 3, and then her final 2 seasons was kind of just surmised by her hookup with Kenny and her breakup drama with Wes and Kelly Ann by Virtue. So she herself was always a supporting character in someone else's plot or in the main plot, but never the main focus. Dunbar made it through 4 seasons. He always did well on the season, or he made it far enough, but he was never really one of the main characters. He had this weird thing with Kimberly and Paula, but in general that was it, as well as his feud with Kelly Ann in 2 of the seasons. Tanya is someone who definitely had a sad trajectory during the season. We saw her get very drunk on Fresh Meat, though she didn't get a whole lot of screen time there. She actually won the Inferno 3, though she was still very hated and she had to deal with that. And then her final 2 seasons were kind of just sad. They're early boots and she was just hazed and made fun of, and then it ended with her beating up Veronica. So, yeah, she never really made it up to the main character point of view, in my opinion. I forgot to mention Jen in this, and she's definitely one of the more important supporting characters of the era. Of course, she had her romance with Rachel, which lasted 2 seasons, and she got into her fair share amount of drama throughout the era, but we did see her politically work her way into the main JEK crew. And I feel like she's more active politically than a lot of the other women in the era. So, yeah. So, this next section are for people who are standout competitors in their era and are often the best competitors on their season, whether they did 1 season, 2 seasons, or 5 or 6 seasons. And like the other categories, the people in the top row debuted in Era 1, and the people on the bottom debuted in Era 2. And like the last era, with this category, the people in this category, on average, usually just has the competitiveness and not much else. They didn't do much seasons, they didn't really have the personality, they didn't have the drama, and they didn't really have the politics. So, with some of the people who are just about the competition and they are here, this is where they fit. So, the first person I'm going to mention is Alton, where he had a very dominant performance on the Gauntlet. He was one of the most dominant... his run on the Gauntlet 2 is one of the most dominant ever, and people are still talking about it today. And while he wasn't as poor or as well in the Inferno 3, I do think he still did a good enough job, hence him being on here. Derek is also someone who definitely fits this category because he had a very strong Gauntlet 2, and he mainly had the competition and not much else, especially as the era went on. But I don't know if he was the best ever, but he was almost always like the second or the third best. But I think him being known mainly for the competition came from this era. Jodie had a very strong The Duel too, and it's one of the most dominant performances by a woman. So here she is, despite her only doing 2 seasons in the era, and she's solid enough on the Gauntlet 2 as a woman as well. Susie is also another woman who had a very dominant season competitively with the Inferno 3, with her winning so many of the life shielders, though some could diminish it by saying Kira was helping her win it by throwing it, and she also won every elimination that she was thrown in on the Ruin, so she definitely held her own during those 2 seasons. Landon is someone who, like Alton, mainly did the challenge for the competitions, and that was all he did. He didn't get into drama, he didn't get into the politics, he is solely about competing, where his performances on Fresh Meats 2, and especially the Duel 2, despite him not making it onto the final there, are very dominant, where he won most of the challenges on the Duel 2, and he held his own very well on Fresh Meat 2, hence him being here. Abram is someone who didn't do many seasons in the era, and the 2 seasons that he actually made it far on, i.e. Cutthroat and the Inferno 3, he was definitely the top competitor on those teams, so I felt like he was deserving of a spot. Evan is someone who's low-key the best competitor on quite a few of his seasons. That was the case with the Gauntlet 3. He was kind of the main vet holding it together. He was definitely the best competitor on Fresh Meat before he was pulled, and I'm sure there are a few others that I'm forgetting. Oh, he definitely did have strong performances on the Ruined as well as the Duel 2, which he of course won that season, hence him being here. Evelyn was always known as one of the stronger women, even when she was booted very early in her first season, and in her second season where she didn't get to do a whole lot, despite making it to the end. But she really started proving herself with the Gauntlet 3, where she was essentially treated like a man, and it wasn't because she was a lesbian, but it was because she could compete with the men, and this went to the point where even on the island, the men who were against her all season decided to team up with her and threw their women allies under their bus because they felt like they couldn't compete with her. And the final person on this tier, or in this grouping, is Laurel, who had a very dominant performance on Fresh Meats 2, and it's clear that she is the reason why she and Kenny won so many of those dailies on that season. And on Cutthroat, she was arguably the best woman on the Grey team as well, with her and Abram holding it together for that team. So I felt like she was worthy of putting in this placement. And it says a lot because she debuted on the last 2 seasons of the era and didn't really get much time to do much of anything as a result of that. But she proved herself competitively, and she made it to her first 2 finals in her first 2 seasons. So I want to do a second tier of the supporting characters in this era, and these are mainly people who were on 3 seasons for the most part. These are people who either started strong but faded out due to the lack of consistency or got booted early during the few seasons that they're in. Sarah is on here because she debuted within the last 3 seasons of the era, and just due to that, she didn't have much time to do anything. Nehemiah is someone who debuted earlier on in the era, but he was just very inconsistent, and he never really had any major storylines. I just remember him getting into that weird bands with Beth. He won a season, but he still wasn't the most visible, and then he was booted early on his 3rd season. Tori was on 3 seasons, and she did well in all of them, but she was mainly seen as Brad's girlfriend turned wife, and she didn't really get much focus on her own. Tyree and Siobhan are people who did 3 seasons in the era, but they're all booted early. I don't know if I'm going to include them in the collage, but I'm talking about them because they did 3 seasons here. Melinda was booted early on her 1st season. Then she made it over halfway in her other 2 seasons, where her relationship turned marriage was focused on in her first 2 seasons especially. Duel won one of his 3 seasons. Then he beat up Brad on his second season, where he could have achieved his fifth win, and then he was booted very early on his third season. I already spoke about Landon briefly in the section above, but he did 3 seasons in the era. He won 2 seasons, and he just missed the final on his third season, but he was very inconsistent and didn't bring much character-wise. Beth is someone who actually started very strong, as she was arguably the main character in the Gauntlet 2. She was one of the 6 confessional givers on that season, and then she had a pretty strong enough Duel season despite making it halfway. But her final season ended on a whimper, and she wouldn't be on the show anymore in the second half. Jillian is someone who did well during her 3 seasons, despite her not being the biggest character, with the exception of the Gauntlet 3, obviously, but I thought she is a worthy mention. Tyler is someone who got booted very early on his first 2 seasons, and then he won his third season, so he's kind of weird when it comes to sporadic performances and seasons. Abram is someone who technically did well on. He could have done well on all the seasons that he was on, but obviously he chose to leave early on the island. He did very well on the Inferno 3 and Cutthroat, and I already kind of talked about him in the prior section as well. So, in general, I definitely have a lot less to say about Era 2 compared to Era 1. And I think one of the reasons for this is due to a lot of the foundation of the show in general was done in Era 1, making the season by season breakdown when it comes to the evolution a lot more interesting, where that really isn't present like that on Era 2. Most of the seasons had the large teams, but I guess the difference is that on Era 1 they were mainly split by real world versus world rules. But on this season on this era, we had some seasons that were good guys versus bad guys. We had some seasons that were divided by rookies versus veterans, champions by challengers, and some were just randomly chosen teams, or they're chosen by a few people. So I guess the distribution of the teams were different. I guess this season had the introduction of some of the more individual challengers, mainly by the Duel series. So individual winners. There's no ties to any team or partnerships. Oh, yes, this era also introduced partnership twists or partnership seasons, with the fresh meat seasons both being partner seasons. And partners, especially, would be a lot more prevalent in Era 3, though there are a few more individual seasons there. But it's mainly the partner seasons that really carries that next era, which started here, so I will mention that. Era 1 in general was known for the more summer campy vibe and the frat bro or the sorority sister vibe to it, mainly due to just the isolatory element of the first 4 seasons, causing it to be a lot more secluded. And the seasons after the 5th season in general, they had that higher summer camp vibe because they're all living in one house. There really wasn't a whole lot of strategizing, and the drama in itself was nowhere near as toxic compared to Era 2, where Era 2 was mainly about competing. They're taking the show a lot more seriously. They really wanted to win, and they really kept the house structure rigid for several seasons within the era, and they were very obnoxious about it too. And there was a lot of toxic drama and a lot of horrible events that are still seen as some of the worst in challenge history. And one of the reasons why this was done is because apparently there's a few times during this era where the show was getting low ratings and they were on the verge of being cancelled. So, some of the cast members were probably acting up so they could get more ratings, and some of the producers, as well as the network, most likely encouraged this. But of course, it ended up backfiring due to someone filing them paperwork and due to the environment changing. But we'll get more into that once we get into Era 3. When it comes to the mid to late 2000s, it was essentially the Wild Wild West when it comes to the reality TV world, especially in competitive reality TV.
competitive reality TV definitely blew up, but there are other competitive reality channels that were blowing up, and they had a lot more ratchet, raunchy drama. And I think the challenge wanted to implement a lot of that on their show, especially because they really weren't on network television like that compared to the CBS shows. But even they were starting to get a bit more ratchet as well. Overall, this era definitely moved on from the summer campy vibes, and we had a lot more of the men who were able to bring drama. They're able to be comedic as well, and I feel like the men were a lot more multifaceted when it came to the personality, the competition, and the drama elements. Where a lot of the era one men were kind of one-track minded in this regard, with the exception of a few. And we saw a lot more storylines carried on from season to season to season to season that was a lot more consistent in Era 2, which really wasn't the case in in Era 1. Like I mentioned earlier, we definitely needed a new crop of people to take over the show, and I definitely feel like Era 2 did that. But once we get into Era 3 and Era 4, and even if you compare um, or include the spin-offs, you could say that the Era 2 players in general had less longevity and they're kind of just secluded to their own era, or in the beginning of Era 3, where a lot of the big names of the era just stopped doing the challenge. But we'll get more into that in the future eras. When I really think about it, I don't know whether I like Era 2 more than Era 1 overall. Obviously, Era 1 definitely had a lot of struggles, trials, and tribulations just due to the formats for the beginning of the show really not being what the show is associated with in general. And that caused for a decent amount of weaker seasons. And there were some decent seasons in that era as well, but I don't know if it really holds up to many of the mid tier or even the top tier seasons. But with Era 2, we definitely do have some top tier seasons like the Duel, Cutthroat, and even the fresh meats are pretty good. And I liked the Gauntlet 3, though there are some pretty horrible seasons, especially with the island seasons with messy formats like the Gauntlet 2 and heck, even the Gauntlet 3, to be honest. And some other seasons that were kind of just there, in my opinion. And a lot of the ickiness just really rubs me the wrong way. And I know a lot of the fans talk about how Era 3, or essentially late Era 2 through mid Era 3, is the best run of the show's history. But there's definitely a decent amount of seasons I just didn't care for or like. Of course, I mentioned the Island, the Inferno 3, and kind of the Ruins fits into that as well. And it's interesting because when it gets to Era 4, and I definitely have my issues with some of those seasons, I don't even know if some of those weaker Era 4 seasons will be in the bottom 10. So that's something that I'm definitely looking forward to. But I'm definitely happy that I made it halfway through this rewatch so far, and I didn't expect for it to go so quickly. But I guess it just means that I'm finding it a breeze to get through. So, anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.